Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another fascinating journey. Today, we're tackling something big, like really big.
Bigger than a bread box.
Way bigger. We're talking about the entire history of humankind. That's right, we're going all the way back to the very beginnings.
The Big Bang.
Ha ha ha, not quite that far back. We're focusing on Homo sapiens. You know, us.
Ah, right. Our story. From humble beginnings to, well, everything we see around us today.
Exactly. How did we go from just another animal wandering around to building skyscrapers and sending rockets into space? It's a pretty wild ride, and our guide for this adventure is Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind.
A fantastic book, full of insights.
Absolutely. We'll be hitting all the major milestones, of course, those revolutions that changed the game completely.
The cognitive revolution.
Huh?
The agricultural revolution.
Yeah.
And, let's not forget, the scientific revolution.
Right. But we're also going to unearth those hidden gems, those surprising and maybe even a little strange details about the lives of our ancestors.
And I think you'll find those details really highlight the ingenuity and resourcefulness of early humans. To start, we need to go way back, before recorded history even began. Imagine this. Humans have been around for about 2.5 million years.
That's a long time.
It is, but here's the thing. What we think of as history only started around 70,000 years ago.
Okay, 2.5 million years versus 70,000 years. That's a huge difference. What were we doing for all that time?
Well, for the vast majority of our existence, we weren't exactly building pyramids or writing symphonies. Early humans were just trying to survive, like any other animal.
So, one species among many. Not particularly special in the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. But then something incredible happened. Around 70,000 years ago, the cognitive revolution.
So what was it? What sparked this cognitive revolution? What suddenly made us so, well, human?
That's where things get really interesting. The cognitive revolution brought with it some major developments. The development of language, abstract thought, but perhaps most importantly,
What's more important than language?
the power of imagination, something truly unique to Homo sapiens.
Imagination. How does that help you conquer the world? Sounds more like something you'd need for, I don't know, writing poetry.
It's more profound than that. You see, imagination allows us to believe in things that don't physically exist.
Like what? Give me an example.
Things like gods, nations, even corporations. These are all collective myths. They exist in our minds, in our shared imagination.
A shared imagined reality.
Yeah.
I like that. It's like we created a whole new set of rules for the game of life, and it completely changed the way we play.
That's a great way to put it. But before we get too deep into the mind-bending stuff, let's take a step back. Let's talk about another revolutionary moment.
Okay, what else changed the game for early humans?
Fire.
Ah, fire. I mean, talk
Yeah.
about a game changer, right?
Absolutely. Fire, and more specifically, the invention of cooking, was a pivotal moment. It had some surprising consequences.
Here's a fun fact. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, they spend around 5 hours a day just chewing raw food. Imagine spending 5 hours of every single day just chewing.
Can you imagine?
But with cooked food, sapiens could get all the nutrients they needed in just 1 hour.
It's incredible, isn't it? Think about the time and energy this freed up.
Right. Our ancestors could suddenly focus on other things, like developing tools, building shelters.
And perhaps even, as some scientists believe, growing those big brains of ours.
Wait, are you saying cooking made us smarter?
Some researchers believe there's a strong connection. Cooked food is much easier to digest. This means our intestines could actually become shorter over time.
Okay, shorter intestines. What's the connection to bigger brains?
Well, both long intestines and large brains, they require a huge amount of energy. So by shortening our guts, we may have inadvertently freed up the energy our brains needed to grow larger.
So that pot roast you had for dinner might have actually helped you ace that test. I knew there was a reason I loved cooking. But, you know, all this talk about the benefits of cooking and the rise of sapiens, it does make you think about the impact we've had on other species.
It's something we need to consider.
Harari talks about this quite a bit, especially when it comes to megafauna, those giant creatures that roamed the earth. And it's not always a happy story, is it?
No, it's not. There's a dark side to our success. You see, wherever sapiens migrated, a wave of extinctions often followed. It happened in Australia. It happened in America.
It's a pattern we still see today, unfortunately.
Sure is.
Take Australia, for example. Before humans arrived, it was like a scene out of a prehistoric fantasy novel. You had giant kangaroos hopping around, massive wombat-like creatures called diprotodons, and these fearsome marsupial lions.
Incredible creatures.
But within a few thousand years of sapiens setting foot on the continent, these incredible creatures vanished. Gone.
The timing is hard to ignore.
It really makes you wonder, what kind of impact are we having on the planet today? And what responsibility do we have to future generations? Are we destined to repeat the mistakes of the past?
These are questions we'll continue to explore as we dive deeper into the story of Sapiens. Because after the cognitive revolution, things really started to accelerate. We see the emergence of agriculture, the rise of cities and empires.
And that's where things get really complex, right? Like, we went from small bands of hunter-gatherers to these massive, organized societies. How did that happen?
Well, remember that power of imagination we talked about?
The one that lets us believe in things that don't exist?
Exactly. That plays a crucial role here. You see, these larger societies, they needed ways to maintain order, to justify hierarchies and power structure.
Okay, so how did they do that?
Through, you guessed it, shared myths and beliefs.
So we're talking about things like caste systems, religious hierarchies, social classes, all these different ways of organizing people and explaining why some have more power than others.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that these systems, while seemingly different, they all rely on the same basic principle, the creation of an imagined order, a shared belief system. That justifies the way things are.
So it's all a bit of a story we tell ourselves.
In a way, yes.
Harari gives a really interesting example of this. He compares the principles of justice found in Hammurabi's code. That's a Babylonian law code from almost 4,000 years ago. He compares it with the U.S. Declaration of Independence, written in 1776.
Two very different documents. On the surface.
Right. The Declaration of Independence famously proclaims that all men are created equal.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Exactly. But Hammurabi's code, on the other hand, outlines a very clear hierarchy, with different punishments for different social classes.
If you were a slave and you injured a nobleman, you were in big trouble. But if you were a nobleman and you injured a slave, not so much.
It's like two completely different ideas of justice.
Precisely. And yet, both documents claim to be based on universal and eternal principles of justice.
Okay, but hold on. If both are based on universal truth, but have wildly different outcomes, isn't that a bit of a contradiction?
It is, and that's precisely Harari's point. He argues that both systems, despite their differences, are ultimately based on imagined realities, not objective truths.
It's like saying, this is the way it is, because we all agree that this is the way it is. But what happens when people stop agreeing?
That's when things get really interesting, and that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've got these complex societies popping up all over the place with their own unique sets of rules and beliefs. But how do people actually manage to, like, trade and cooperate within these vast systems? I mean, it's not like you could just send someone a quick email or pay with a credit card back then.
Right. That's where another brilliant human invention comes in.
Ooh, what's that?
Money.
Ah, yes. Money, the root of all evil, right?
Not necessarily. It's more accurate to think of money as, well, a system of mutual trust that goes beyond individual communities. It allows for cooperation and exchange on a scale that wouldn't be possible otherwise.
Okay, I'll bite. How does a little piece of paper or a shiny coin create trust between complete strangers?
Think about it this way. You accept a dollar bill in exchange for goods or services. Why? Because you trust that someone else will also accept that dollar bill later on.
So it's like we're all collectively agreeing to pretend that this piece of paper is actually worth something.
Exactly. And that collective agreement, that's what gives money its power.
Another example of how imagined realities shape our world. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. And the evolution of money is fascinating too. We started with things like barley money in ancient Mesopotamia.
Barley money, like actual barley.
Literally, using fixed amounts of barley grains to measure and exchange value.
Can you imagine lugging sacks of barley around to buy things? Talk about an inconvenient wallet.
I know, right? But then we moved on to gold coins, paper bills, and now we've got digital currencies, cryptocurrencies.
It's like money itself has gone through its own cognitive revolution.
I like that. And what's interesting is that throughout all this evolution, the underlying principle has remained the same: trust.
Even the slogan, "In God We Trust," on U.S. currency, it highlights this reliance on belief.
We trust that the system will continue to function, that our money will hold its value.
But that trust can be fragile, can't it? I mean, we've seen time and again how economic systems can collapse when people lose faith in the currency or the institutions behind it.
That's true, which makes it all the more remarkable that these systems have endured for as long as they have.
It speaks to the power of shared beliefs, I guess, and our ability to cooperate on a large scale. It makes you wonder, though, what about the idea of nations? Weren't those always a part of the human story?
Not necessarily the concept of a nation, as we understand it today. It's a relatively recent phenomenon.
Hold on. Nations are imagined, but they seem so real, so concrete, with their borders, their governments, their flags.
Of course, nations have tangible elements. But the idea of a nation, that feeling of belonging to a group with a shared history and destiny, that's something that exists primarily in our minds.
So you're saying that feeling of patriotism, of national pride, it's all a bit of a construct.
To a certain extent, yes. We imagine ourselves as part of a nation, based on shared myths, symbols, a sense of a common past.
But these narratives, they're often carefully constructed, aren't they? And they can change over time.
Precisely.
Okay, I need an example. What about a country like, say, the United States? That feels like a pretty solid nation, with a long history and a clear sense of identity.
Even the United States, with its seemingly long history, is a relatively young nation. And its national identity, it's been constantly evolving, shaped by waves of immigration, social movements, political upheavals.
So it's not like these nations just appeared out of thin air, fully formed. They're constantly being shaped and reshaped by the people who live in them.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that national boundaries, they're often arbitrary lines drawn on a map.
Reflecting historical power dynamics, I guess, rather than any inherent differences between people.
Right.
That makes you think about all those wars that have been fought over national borders and identities. It's like, if these divisions are largely imagined, what are we really fighting for?
It's a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. And it leads us to another intriguing point that Harari makes.
Oh, what's that?
Despite all the conflict and division, the decades since World War II, they've actually been the most peaceful in human history.
Wait, seriously, but what about all the wars we see on the news every day? What about terrorism and political instability and all the other scary stuff?
Those things are real, and they cause immense suffering. But if we look at the broader picture, the overall trend has been towards less violence.
Fewer people die in wars today than at any other point in human history.
Exactly.
So it's like we're focusing on the trees and missing the forest.
You could say that. We tend to focus on the dramatic events, the conflicts that make headlines. But the bigger picture, it's one of increasing peace and cooperation.
It's a pretty hopeful thought, actually, especially when it feels like the world is constantly on the brink of chaos.
It is hopeful. It suggests that we're capable of learning from our mistakes, of building a more peaceful and cooperative world.
Okay, so less war, more cooperation. But has all this progress, all this technological advancement and societal complexity, has it actually made us happier?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Are we, with all our gadgets and our comforts, truly better off than our hunter-gatherer ancestors, who lived much simpler lives?
It's a question that philosophers and scientists have been grappling with for centuries.
And I bet they still don't have a definitive answer.
Well, in recent decades, researchers have developed ways to study happiness more objectively.
Really? How do you measure something as subjective as happiness?
Well, it starts with simply asking people how they feel. Psychologists use questionnaires where people rate their level of satisfaction with their lives, their sense of purpose, their overall mood.
So it's like a giant happiness survey.
You could say that. And by comparing these self-reported levels of happiness with various factors like income, social relationships, health, researchers can start to see what truly correlates with happiness.
So have they found a magic formula, a secret recipe for a happy life?
Well, that's where things get really interesting and maybe a little surprising.
Ooh, I love surprises. Lay it on me.
What researchers are finding is that our happiness, it may be less about external factors like wealth or status,
And more about...
our internal biochemistry.
Hold up, are you saying happiness is just a chemical reaction in our brains?
In a way, yes. Our brains are complex systems, and our feelings of happiness are influenced by neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin.
Okay, so brain chemicals. I'm following.
These chemicals play a key role in regulating our mood, our sense of pleasure, our overall well-being.
So it's not about having the perfect job or the biggest house. It's about having the right balance of brain chemicals.
Well, not entirely. Those external factors can certainly influence our brain chemistry. But the point is, our subjective experience of happiness, it's ultimately rooted in our biology.
Okay, so if happiness is largely determined by biochemistry, does that mean it's predetermined? Are we all just stuck with a set level of happiness based on our genes?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of the nature versus nurture debate. While our genes do play a role in our predisposition to happiness, our experiences and our choices can also influence our brain chemistry.
So it's not like we're just robots programmed to be happy or unhappy. We have some say in the matter.
Absolutely. Think of it this way. Your genes provide the blueprint, but your experiences and your choices, they're like the construction crew.
They determine how that blueprint is ultimately expressed.
Precisely.
So we're not slaves to our genes, but we're not completely free agents either. It's a dynamic interplay between nature and nurture.
Exactly. And it makes the study of happiness all the more fascinating.
Okay, deep divers, we've journeyed through the history of Sapiens, explored the mysteries of happiness, and now we're venturing into the uncharted territory of the future. Hold on tight.
The pace of technological change is accelerating exponentially. We're on the cusp of breakthroughs, from genetic engineering to artificial intelligence, that could fundamentally reshape the human story.
It's like we're living in a science fiction novel.
And speaking of science fiction, Harari talks about something called the Gilgamesh Project.
The Gilgamesh Project, what's that?
It's the age-old human quest for immortality.
Immortality, you mean like living forever?
Exactly. And while immortality might still be in the realm of myth, the idea of significantly extending human lifespans, it's becoming increasingly plausible.
Wait, are you saying we might actually be able to cheat death?
It's certainly a possibility. We're seeing rapid advancements in areas like regenerative medicine and gene editing. That could potentially slow down or even reverse the aging process.
Wow. We might achieve immortality. But then what? What would it mean for society if people lived for hundreds of years? Would we need to rethink our entire social and economic systems?
Absolutely. It raises all sorts of ethical and societal questions.
It's like that saying, be careful what you wish for.
Right. And here's another mind-boggling thought. What happens when we combine these life-extending technologies with advancements in genetic engineering? We could potentially design our own babies, choose their traits, enhance their abilities.
Wow. Talk about playing God. We're entering an era where we might be able to control our own evolution.
It's both exhilarating and terrifying, isn't it?
It is. We have the potential to reshape humanity in profound ways. But we also have the responsibility to use these technologies wisely and ethically.
Absolutely.
Okay, deep divers, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the cognitive revolution to the rise of empires and the quest for immortality. It's been a wild ride through history. But there's one more crucial aspect of the human story we need to explore.
Oh, what have we missed?
The stories we tell ourselves.
Stories. Yes. Stories have always been central to the human experience. They shape our beliefs, our values, our understanding of the world.
From the ancient myths and legends, passed down through generations, to the narratives we consume through books, movies, social media, stories have the power to inspire, to unite, and to divide.
You're right. And in today's world, where information flows at an unprecedented rate, understanding the power of stories is more important than ever.
So how do we navigate this sea of narratives? How do we discern fact from fiction? How do we avoid being swept away by the tide of misinformation?
That's where critical thinking comes in. It's the ability to question assumptions, to evaluate evidence, and to form our own informed opinions.
So it's not just about being smart, it's about being discerning and questioning the information we encounter.
Precisely. It's about recognizing our own biases, understanding how information can be manipulated, and seeking out diverse perspectives.
It feels like we're just constantly bombarded with information these days. News headlines, social media, that endless stream of videos and articles online, it's overwhelming.
It can be.
How do we even sift through it all and figure out what's actually true?
That's where, like we were saying, critical thinking comes in. It's like you need a mental filter to help you separate fact from fiction, signal from noise.
Right. It's not just about being smart. It's more than that. It's about being discerning, questioning the information you encounter.
Exactly. It's about recognizing your own biases. It's about understanding how information can be manipulated, and it's about seeking out diverse perspectives.
Harari, he talks a lot about the power of stories. and how they shape our understanding of the world. But how do we even know which stories to trust? Especially now. It's not always easy to tell what's real, what's fabricated, especially in the age of deepfakes and online misinformation.
You're absolutely right. And it's why we need to be, well, extra vigilant. Critical thinking isn't about dismissing everything you hear. It's about engaging with the information actively, asking questions, looking for evidence. Does it support the claims or does it refute them?
It's like being a detective, right? Gathering clues, examining the evidence, and then drawing your own conclusions based on the facts.
Exactly. And just like a good detective, a critical thinker, they know there's always more to the story. They're not afraid to challenge assumptions or to consider alternative explanations.
And this all feels, well, particularly relevant today, don't you think? We're surrounded by so much information. Much of it, it seems, designed to, like, grab our attention, trigger our emotions, or to push a particular agenda.
It's more important than ever to be aware of those tactics, to understand how stories can be used to manipulate us, to sell us things, or to shape our opinions.
So critical thinking, it's not just about being a savvy consumer of information. It's bigger than that. It's about being an informed citizen, engaged, because ultimately, the stories we choose to believe, those are the stories that will shape the world we live in.
Well said. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, the future of humankind, it's not preordained. It's not set in stone. We have choices to make, paths to choose. And the story, it's still being written.
We get to write the ending.
In a way, yes, we have the power to create a better future, but it takes effort. We need to be mindful, critical, compassionate.
We need to remember all the lessons we've learned today about imagination, about cooperation, about the power of stories.
If you're as fascinated by the story of Homo sapiens as we are, I highly recommend checking out Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind.
It's a fantastic read. It really makes you think about who we are, where we came from, and where we might be headed.
Until next time, deep divers, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Happy diving.